as you probably know, we've had the budget. We had that on the 20th of May, and unusually we actually had quite a lot of tax in that budget. Budgets of recent years have been notable by not having that much tax stuff in them. And if they've had tax, it's basically not been a secret. It's basically been talked about beforehand. This budget was different. It was had an awful lot of tax stuff in it, and basically me and Carolyn and Jeff have been working on this for months and putting this budget together for the government. We actually work for Inland Revenue in the policy section, so our job is to basically provide tax policy advice to our minister, who is Peter Dunn, and we also work with Treasury providing advice to Bill English, who's their minister. So we basically, obviously with the government, put this package together, and it's got some good things, and it's got some things that industry aren't necessarily overly overjoyed with. So what I thought we'd do is, there's a lot in it. We're going to rip through it quite quickly because it's probably more interesting if you have questions, to be honest, and we can answer those questions. I'm just going to quickly go through a little bit of the context to the budget and why the government ended up putting the budget that it put together, basically.
You just need to stand to one side.
Sorry, I'm the way. Yep. Sorry about that. So you probably heard that about this Victoria University Tax Working Group. Basically, the government was keen. It got into office in November 2008. It was keen to basically make changes to the tax system. When it came into office, it had a tax policy of reducing the top tax rate to 30%. Like it was when it came to government, it was 38%. Its policy was to reduce the top tax rate down to 30%. And the reason for that was to align it with the company tax rate. So it wanted a tax system whereby the top personal rate was the same as the company rate, and also they wanted to reduce the trustee rate, the trust tax rate, down to 30 as well. So you had this nice simple 30, 30, 30. And the reason for that is because is to make the system simpler, to stop incentives that people currently have to put their money into trusts to avoid the top personal rate. Because it's currently quite easy if you've got investment income and things like that. If you want to avoid the top personal tax rate of 38, all you do is you put your money into a trust and it's taxed at 33. It's pretty simple. The government was keen to get rid of all that game playing, and so basically it was in coalition government, or it is in coalition government with the ACT Party. It's got a confidence and supply agreement with the ACT Party to reduce tax rates to 30, 30, 30, and it was keen to do that. Now the problem was that when it took over in November 2008, that was basically when the fiscal crisis hit, the financial crisis, and the government went from basically having huge surpluses to having deficits. So basically it went from a situation where they were collecting too much tax revenue to a situation where they weren't collecting enough tax revenue. And how do they actually have a system whereby they reduce tax rates to 30% when they're not collecting enough money? So the government was basically decided to give that job to the tax working group. And what the tax working group was basically established by the Victoria University, and its job was basically to come up with recommendations to the government whereby it could implement its 30, 30, 30 approach, but also raise enough tax revenue to get us through the fiscal deficits. So that was quite a tough ask, actually, and the government was really keen to be divorced from this process. So it didn't want to be the ones that were seen to be establishing this group, because if they were, they would be linked with a group that was effectively raising taxes, and governments don't like that. That they want to be. They don't want to be the ones that recommend these things. They want to be the ones that just agree reluctantly to these things. So anyway, so that's the context for it. And basically this group, and Carolyn and me were on it, it was basically set up, it had tax practitioners, academics, and some business leaders, and its job was basically to try and answer this question for the government, this extremely tricky question. And basically, we had a few sessions with them to start with, And the first thing that we try to do is kind of soften them up a little bit. And this is the graph that we showed them, and this is Treasury data basically. The grey line is what the government collects in revenue basically, and the black line is what its spending is. Okay, and you see before 2008, big surpluses, huge surpluses. This was a time when Cullen was in government, and basically he was being accused, and you probably remember at the time, of raising too much tax and not giving enough back in tax cuts. And that's this big chunky gap. And he refused to give tax cuts for a long, long time. He gave them right before the election, and by then it was probably too late. But he introduced KiwiSaver instead. But basically 2008 hit, and this is where the national government got into power, and you see pretty much straight away reversal. Big deficits. So how the hell were they going to do this policy of 30-30-30 in a world where they actually needed to raise more tax revenue? It's almost very hard to square that circle. So that was the job of this tax working group, to come up with answers, basically. The other point here is that if I carry this Treasury forecast out to 2020, you would see these two lines starting to come together again. So Treasury was forecasting that with the current system, we would come back into, as the economy grew, we would come back into balance. But one of the key projections of us coming back into balance, one of the key assumptions, was that basically this thing called fiscal drag was built into it. So this thing that said that, I don't know if you know what fiscal drag is, this is a situation where if I'm on a wage, and my wage is simply keeping up with inflation, so it's going up by 2 or 3% a year just to keep up with inflation, I'm economically no better off, right, under that scenario. But the way our tax system works is that I get taxed more and more and more each year, because the thresholds and our tax system isn't adjusted. The thresholds are not, the thresholds at which each rate kick in are not adjusted to keep pace with inflation. So I'm on 69,000. I get my pay rise and tax me over to 70,000. I hit the new rate. I'm no better off, but I'm being taxed more, and that's called fiscal drag. And one of the key assumptions that Treasury made with us getting back into balance was fiscal drag. And what that meant was that by 2020, the average worker would be on the top tax rate. And that was one of their key assumptions for us getting back into balance. And the tax working group realised that was completely not sustainable. You cannot have a tax system where the average worker is on the top tax rate, especially a top tax rate that's 38%. So they quickly realised that something had to be done, and they were basically softened up to come up with recommendations to raise tax. And the sorts of areas they were looking at were capital gains taxes, land taxes, increasing GST, basically hitting the property sector. They were very concerned that the property sector, especially the rental property sector, was not paying its fair share of tax, and that they were basically looking at that. And what did they end up recommending to government? Well, they basically agreed with the government policy that the top trust rate, personal rate and company rate should be aligned, and preferably at 28, but they accepted that 30 would be okay. They accepted that a company rate needs to remain internationally competitive. They didn't really have agreement on whether that should be dropped or not, but they said it needed to be internationally competitive. They wanted to increase GST to 15% to achieve those top tax rates, and they also wanted to hit the property sector with what was called a risk-free rate of return method on rental housing. So basically tax rental housing at a deemed return of about 5% a year. And they also, on balance, wanted to introduce a land tax. And a land tax is effectively a tax of 1% on the value of your land every year, on top of your rates. And that's what they wanted to do. And that was basically the recommendations that they gave to government.